Welcome everybody to the next round of the Connected Health webinars. We're just going to give it one more minute to allow the others to attend, and then we're going to kick off. So that's 1 minute past. Welcome everybody. My name's Josh Gladstone. I'm the newly appointed Connected Health lead, and I want to thank everybody for coming today and taking that time. Joining me today from Fortinet is Michael Murphy, who's dialing in from Sydney, and we've got Medigate's Steve Woods, who's dialing in from Perth. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute, but just a few housekeeping items to start off with. We've got the chat there. Please use it throughout the session for questions. We've got a few questions beforehand, and we'll do our best to answer them as they go along. We've got some handouts, which I do encourage you to check out as well. And this session will be recorded at a later stage as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the team, Michael and Stephen. And Michael, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So before I do, I think there's one thing that I kind of wanted to highlight. I think when we open these discussions within these domains, a lot of the time the key takeaway or the walkaway factor is quite negative. We've got a lot that we're talking through and a lot of troubling concerns. I quite like the saying, and it's self-indulgent, but Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But I think on this short journey today, it's really important that we keep a positive mindset. And I like to kind of adopt Matthew McConaughey's perspective from Interstellar, where anything that can happen will happen. And I think we're all coming together, we're all collaborating to really hug the cactus and acknowledge that there are challenges, there are threats that we do observe, and we need to come together to mitigate those together. So a little bit of context behind myself. Ultimately, I began my career as a practitioner, performing and building incident response and digital forensics practices. Through those activities, I was able to earn a tremendous level of exposure into a broad range of different critical infrastructure verticals, including healthcare, and across multi-regions that ultimately were exposed to different threats and different scenarios. I was also fortunate to spend some time at McAfee with the Poundstone Group, and then ultimately have been fortunate to join Fortinet to really build out the OT, ICS, and medical strategy and execution pathways for Asia Pacific. There are a couple of other initiatives that I also support, one of which is an open threat information sharing domain known as OTISARC for APAC. Certainly something that's worth kind of enrichment and subscribing to learn more about the threat landscape broader than what's local and national. We do some work with the ICS Advisory Project, which I'll highlight in a moment, and also do some training for engineers as part of what's known as RealPARs. So with that, I'll introduce Steve and let him kind of provide some context behind himself and his wealth of experience in the landscape. Steve?
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. So hi, everyone. Steve Woods, based in Perth. I am the Principal SE for Healthcare for Medigate. I come from a healthcare family, similar to Michael, actually. So I have a mum that's a nurse and my sister is a doctor. I'm fortunate enough to work in Australia and APAC and also in the UK across networking, security, and obviously healthcare. So that's a bit of my background. I will be talking with you a bit later on the Medigate platform itself, but back to Michael for now.
Wonderful, thanks, Steve. So I think when we begin to look at the landscape, it's important to understand the trends and the observations of lessons past. And I think what many of us have observed is it's a bit of an arms race, right? The malicious threat actors that are targeting the organizations that we work within or work for are constantly pivoting in mechanisms that they can adopt to ultimately compromise and cause operational harm or damage. And what I think is important to look at is, from a very high level, what's actually taken place. So when we look at some of the simple kind of attacks that did take place, many of them relied on some form of application that had to be run or executed. It required an end user to actually click on a link and open an executable or initiate a DLL or a binary to actually perform some kind of malicious manipulation, right? We then saw that there was the application of things like antivirus that adopted signatures, that looked at known activities that were malicious, that could proactively or reactively block those activities. We also saw that heuristics were adopted, so looking at behavioral trends that had been historically observed, or activities that were not necessarily competent capable for individuals to perform in a set period of time. From that, we also saw that there was a shift to the adoption of machine learning, right? So using the system, using compute to understand what activities may potentially lead to malicious outcomes. From that, we also saw that there was the adoption of behavioral analytics as well, right? So was a critical service or function of the business being accessed from a geolocation that simply wasn't possible based on where the position of a resource was or a person was interfacing with the system. It was very rudimentary, it was very simple, and ultimately it was quite effective as well. Now, elements of these key components are still adopted when we look to protect critical systems, but what we also observe is many assets, especially within the medical realm, don't have the luxury of the deployment for things like an agent. You can also run into lifecycle management challenges. You can inadvertently deploy updates that may cause malicious manipulation to your network as well. We certainly observe that operational disruption leads to downtime. Downtime leads to ultimately revenue loss, and revenue loss can lead to irreversible brand damage associated with life and death scenarios. So from that, what we kind of saw was threat actors began to pivot, and they began to look at ways that they could actually leverage the operating system against itself in many ways, and actually circumnavigate many of the historical controls that we'd learned to adopt and implement within our networks. And that was things through simple channels like PowerShell or command line, and again, using those native controls that were built into the OS against itself. With that, we saw that there was the development of frameworks, and these frameworks were ways of looking at activity across the network, from endpoint, network, and the cloud, to really observe how you can stitch together activities that may have been observed that in isolation were legitimate, but when they were actually stitched together, could cause some very malicious challenges, and certainly things that needed to be overcome. Now, when we look at MITRE, that's generally looking at the very advanced persistent kind of activities that take place, but it's still something that's front of mind. So with kind of this context, I think it's important to look at, well, what are threat actors doing now? How are they targeting the medical and healthcare industry? And what can we learn from these kind of motivators that they take? There are three simple kind of ingredients that are required right now, and these are the things that we are actively observing. Many of you may be familiar with what's known as Shodan. Shodan is an internet search engine that allows you to simply discover assets within your network that are publicly accessible from the internet. And that may be based on a simple product misconfiguration. It might be based on a contractor that's come into your network and simply look for the pathway of least resistance to connect it to the internet, to maybe activate a license, or even pull an update that's required for the deployment of that asset. You'll also need the internet, and if you're keen, it's not necessary. You can look at different mechanisms to actually hide your identity as well, so adopting something like a Tor browser. But ultimately, these are the three simple ingredients that are free to leverage, and this is what threat actors are kind of focusing a lot of their time, energy, and effort on. So with that, when we begin to look at the pathway of least resistance, we look at the ways that these tools are used, right? And I want to focus on the fact that none of the activities performed are actually using a vulnerability. We're not using some form of exploit. We're literally looking at a web search of OT assets that are publicly accessible via the internet. Once we've performed a simple search, we're able to discover assets, and that might be based within the proximity of the location that you have critical infrastructure or an office space or even a ward or some form of hospital facility. From that, you'll be able to drill down further to discover where that asset is placed. And more importantly, in many circumstances where these assets simply have the pre-baked in credentials still being adopted, right? And having that ability to connect to that asset directly. So in many cases, that will be something like a webcam, something that facilitates a rich level of reconnaissance. So a threat actor can learn about your environment. They can learn about the tools. They can learn about the scheduling. They can learn about the staff mechanisms in play to really forge a way of performing malicious activities without being discovered. So again, I want to highlight here, these activities can be performed without some form of vulnerability to be exploited, and it's readily available and can be performed in a short period of time. And these are the kind of things where we're really endeavoring to enable the healthcare sector and also medical devices to be protected from any of these kind of activities. So with that in mind, what happens when we overlap that with what are the known vulnerabilities within the space? Many of you will already be familiar with the CISA, an American initiative that's gathered a lot of traction to highlight what vulnerabilities have actually been discovered, commonly known as CVEs. More importantly, what is the severity of those vulnerabilities being exploited? Now, if we think about what we've just covered in terms of the rich reconnaissance that can be performed without a vulnerability, then we need to think about the way that we can actually use vulnerabilities to exploit critical systems within the healthcare and public health system. We also need to consider the fact that a lot of these assets have not necessarily had cybersecurity built in by design. They've been designed in isolation. They've been designed in a manner that's meant to operate for a fixed function, in many cases without any form of internet connectivity for exposure for malicious manipulation. So when we bring that kind of to a front, we can kind of begin looking at the trends. And one of the key activities that we perform is really listening to the voice of the customer within the landscape. And we interview more than 550 OT specialists, operational technology specialists across 28 different countries to look at the trends that are in play. And what we've seen based on the incidents that are taking place, organizations are beginning to invest and adopt security solutions to build resilience into the network. And they're doing it in a way that does not actually invoke operational disruption to the critical assets that are there to be serviced. And more importantly, that are supporting activities such as human life. When we look at the intrusions that have been experienced, we do see, on average, there is a reduction, which is fantastic. But with that, we also need to acknowledge the fact that they're still taking place. And with that, that's kind of where we need to pivot and look at what are some of the initiatives that are in play to really drive that compliance and drive some form of structure to adopt cybersecurity solutions to continue to reduce the threat landscape. So many of you will be familiar with the Australian Critical Infrastructure Act. It was initially designed, built and developed in 2018. It covered 4 critical industry verticals, and it's since expanded out into 12 industry verticals across 22 sub-asset classes. When we break it down, it looks at 4 key aspects that are deemed to be good cyber hygiene, which is 1, know your assets, understand what OT assets are present within your landscape, understand what assets are deemed of critical nature. Furthermore, understand who actually has accountability for these assets within your environment. Who are the people that are accountable for when things go wrong? And that includes some unique attributes that Steve and I will be covering shortly around who is the asset owner, what are their nationality or nationalities, and how can I reach out and contact them in the event that an incident takes place. The second component of that is really based on how you respond to an incident. Now, there's a very stringent time frame on actually reporting an incident within the medical realm or the healthcare sector, which is 12 hours, right? And what you need confidence to perform is identify, right, there's been some form of activity that's happened within my network. I need to decipher, is that indeed a cybersecurity incident, or alternatively, is it simply a product misconfiguration or an asset that's become faulty and degraded over time that's providing incorrect feedback to my reporting lines. We then move into what's referred to as the systems of national significance, and these systems must comply to enhanced cybersecurity obligations. Now think of these obligations as proactive activities that are going to raise awareness and build that level of resistance and tolerance against threats, such as the ones that we've mentioned earlier, whether it's performing non-invasive scans to discover assets that are misconfigured and openly connected to the internet. Is it assets that do actually have vulnerabilities, and how you can circumnavigate through that through, say, virtual patching? There are different dynamics in play. But a big factor of that, again, is by building out and enhancing knowledge and awareness. The final component of that is now what's referred to as the cyber risk management program, and that is a way of measuring the adoption of cyber resilience in your network. Adopting a framework that's actually going to be a blueprint for success within your network landscape, and that may be something associated with NIST or the Australian Signals Directorate as Central Aid. More importantly, and probably the critical question here for many of you today that have joined, is what is a critical asset within my landscape? And for many of you, it's definitely going to be based on the industry that you service, the assets that you deploy, but more importantly, these sub-asset classes, right? And within the healthcare sector, it's generally if you run a general intensive care unit, and more importantly, there's further sub-asset class information here. Now, again, this is not definitive legal advice, I want to highlight that, but certainly we are here to work through this with you to actually identify, are there critical assets that you need to be aware of and also register with the Australian Signals Directorate and the ACSC. Now, when we kind of go through this, I think there's two things in mind. One is, what are the things that you must do? But more importantly, what is good cyber hygiene? And how can you proactively get ahead of any expanded obligations that may take place? I think we certainly endeavour to secure the assets in a way that is going to hold you in good stead in the future, not because you have to, because you feel it's a duty to care for health and safety as well. So we're more than happy to kind of go through this individually with many of you, as we understand that your network landscapes are different and bespoke in nature, but this document is certainly well graded to assist through that process as well. So with that in mind, we certainly work extensively with industry-based parties so that we can highlight what standards are going to hold you in a positive kind of light when you're looking at the journey to resilience. We work predominantly with SANS to kind of build out a way that you can proactively do that within our ecosystem. More importantly, we've been appropriately recognized where the voice of the customer from our strategy and execution has come into play. And that's where we are really working closely with Steve and the team from Medigate to bring that into fruition. So Steve, I'll hand over to you in a moment, but I think we've got some poll questions that are probably good to touch on before we kind of continue. And I think when we kind of look at some of these questions, it's important to think about your environment specifically and what are the drivers within your business, not only to address the cybersecurity challenges, but more importantly, what are the factors that are going to hold you to account in the future? So I'll give everyone a moment. Hopefully that that poll pops up for everyone. Excellent. Okay, there's certainly some overwhelming feedback there in a moment. Very good. I think we're about 50% voted. Interesting to see the thresholds change Very good. We'll give it another 30 seconds to see how we close that out. I think it's evident to see here that an overwhelming majority of participants certainly do see the Critical Infrastructure Act as that compelling driver, which is fantastic, right? I think not only is it highlighting that there's a response from the initiative from a government perspective, but also just to invoke good cyber hygiene, which is great. I think very good. Yeah, okay. So it's an interesting final figure there, which is certainly, I think it's fair to say, an overwhelming majority. I think we've got another question there too that we're going to bring up in a moment. Now, with regards to this question, I think what's evident is Steve and I, we speak to many organizations, and especially within healthcare and medical industry verticals. We're intrigued because many organizations have a different take on when they need to become accountable for activities that are performed. And certainly, again, as we mentioned, the Critical Infrastructure Act, there are the newly proposed critical asset technologies list that's coming out as well that looks at the technology that underpins and supports critical infrastructure. I'll give everyone a moment to kind of respond to this. But again, I think time frame is something that we all need to be conscious of, right? And again, independent of whether that's based on the Critical Infrastructure Act, which now is fully enforced, or alternative mechanisms of good cyber hygiene internally, it's something that we need to pay attention to. I'm not sure, Steve, if you had any other comments that I may have neglected. Feel free to.
No, I think you summed up nicely. Definitely, we're seeing that from a legislation point of view. It's changed significantly over the last few years. Obviously, legislation generally takes a while to catch up. If you use software copyright as an example, software was protected by book copyright for decades. So I think with the critical infrastructure, we're seeing stuff coming through now, and I think there's going to be further stuff going, particularly around medical device manufacturers and things that they're required to do. So I think legislation is only going to increase. It's going to be an interesting couple of years.
Absolutely. Very good. All right. So there's some interesting feedback there. I think evidently it's an interesting mix. I think it's good to see, and I think the key thing is paying attention to this space. So Steve, I will hand over to you to kind of talk to the intriguing aspect of the incident bit.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael. For those that haven't seen the incident pit, this is something Michael and I have discussed many times actually over the last few months. It was introduced in 1973 at a British dive conference, and it was designed to represent a review of diving incidents. So there's a couple of things that are really important, I guess, to note here. The first one was that incidents can occur really quickly, so within 30 seconds or less, or they can actually occur over a long period of time. So that could be minutes, hours, days, or even months. The incident itself had nothing at all to do with the depth of the water. So many incidents actually occurred in necessarily shallow water. The problem is how quickly the incident escalates from the normal activity at the top in the little blue color to it quickly descends into an emergency and panic. And the whole goal of representing this was how quickly someone can use their experience and their knowledge to get themselves back up out of the pit before you end up in a fatality. The key is with diving, you're obviously with a dive partner. So it could be an incident for yourself, or it could be an incident with your dive partner. The thing that Michael and I really like about this is it applies really well to cybersecurity, and also the requirement around cyber and biomedical to work together, basically as dive buddies. So Michael actually mentioned a couple of things earlier around cyber resilience. Wasn't going to ask you another poll question. But one of the things he mentioned was around dwell time and the fact that people can get into an environment and get around without being detected. We know from reviewing cyber incidents that the average length of time is over 100 days that someone is in an environment and looking around doing reconnaissance. So, they get in through something, they move horizontally through the environment, they escalate privileges, right? So we know how these things work. And so if we relate this back to the incident pit, the problem could be there for weeks or months until it becomes a real big problem. And then, as we've seen with cyber attacks, they can result in death. Okay, so it's a really interesting analogy. So, Michael, I am going to take over and share my screen. Okay. Just going to confirm you can see my dashboard.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so this is the Medigate dashboard, and what I'm actually going to do, I'm not going to do a full product demo or anything, but I just want to run through a couple of things that Michael and I have actually gone through together over the past couple of months when we were discussing some of the, I guess, the practical challenges around the Infrastructure Act. So the first one that Michael talked about was obviously being able to report on your assets. So the fundamental problem is you've got to know what your assets are to start with. And so what I'm showing here in the dashboard is a high-level inventory example in an environment here where we have around 16,000 devices split across 4 different categories, so medical, OT, IoT, and IT. Now, this is not uncommon. This is an example environment, but a lot of the customers that I work with here in Australia and New Zealand, it's not uncommon to see 25,000 plus connected devices in an environment. Okay. Now, this data is built by the way that the platform detects devices, which is predominantly passive. So it was built for healthcare in mind, knowing that in a number of, I guess, environments in healthcare, you can't actively scan medical devices, so they don't necessarily respond particularly well. So we need to treat them carefully. We also understand that as a result of that, there's information that we might go and collect from other systems. So we might obviously discover things like IT devices, physical security cameras, building management systems, and then obviously medical devices. So everything from things like imaging devices through to patient-side devices. Now, the reason that I'm showing you these is when we talk about incidents in healthcare, all of these are potential targets. So as Michael said, it doesn't have to necessarily be a vulnerability. It could be a misconfiguration or something that's exposed, and that becomes the way that people can get in. We've seen attacks in Europe, for example, targeting like elevators, for example. So any of you that worked in a hospital or ever been to hospital, taking out the lifts in a hospital is a nightmare. So that's all I'm really going to show you from I guess a high level point of view. But what I want to show you now is really around the table of information. So one of the things that Michael showed you before was reporting of assets. So there's information that you'll need to provide around critical assets. So I'm just going to show you some examples of the data that we can provide to help customers with that. So for a start, I will pick a couple of things. So obviously IP and MAC, but we want to know the manufacturer, the type and the model of the device. We also want to know the serial number, for example, if it has it, operating system versions, and we potentially want to know other information. And this is where Michael and I discussed this at length actually around the concept of a dive buddy. When we talk about an asset to one group of users, such as networking or cybersecurity, is a different concept to biomedical. So they may be interested, for example, in an asset tag or a serial number, as opposed to an IP address and a MAC address. But ultimately, we need those bits of information to be correlated together so that we can search for that object, regardless of what our perspectives are. Now, I can select these, and I can also include some ownership, okay? And I can populate a table and this table can be filtered. So for example, if I'm only interested maybe in ultrasounds, for example, I can go and filter on those particular types of devices. Now, one of the things that Michael raised when we had this conversation a few months ago was around the reporting of these assets. So obviously I can take this data and I can export it, but there's other information that we need to provide. And so that is the device owner, how to contact them, and also their nationality, which is an interesting one. Now, that information may or may not be available. So it could be available in an asset system. So for example, a CMMS or CMDB, where we could go and query it and assign it to the device. But that information may not be in an asset system. It may not be in an asset system we can query, or a customer may not actually have an asset system. So what we can actually do within the platform is to create some custom attributes. So these I would call something like SOCI owner. I could go and create another attribute, so one called, say, SOCI contact, and then nationality. Okay, so I can go and create, if I can type, nationality. So when I create those attributes, what we can do is add those to the table. So if we're required to populate those, we can do that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick some assets and I'm going to assign them to Michael. So I'm going to say he becomes responsible for everything from Philips, for example. So I'm going to select some Philips devices, so everything from Philips, and now I can actually go and select these devices, and I can go and edit these attributes. So I can say these all now belong to Michael. Okay. So I can update all these attributes that way. Okay. So now I have the ability to look at my SOCI owner, my SOCI contact, and my nationality. So I won't fill out all of those, but you get the idea. Now, one of the challenges that Michael mentioned was around device changes or knowing something happens with a device like a vulnerability. So in the platform, we can actually go and create a user. So I can go and create one. And what I can do is create a dashboard user for Michael, and I can actually go and choose the table view that I'm creating now and assign him that view. So as a user, he logs in, he sees those devices as his default view, and he also receives notifications regarding those particular devices. So if something happens to them, he gets notified. Now, one of the things that is an interesting one, and Michael and I discussed this one actually at length, is if I go and select something, so I'm going to pick on an ultrasound. Let's get rid of this one, maybe do GE. All right, so here's an example of an ultrasound, okay? So when I drill in, what you'll see here is that there's a whole bunch of information regarding the device. So obviously an IT person, IP and MAC, but if I'm looking at it from a device point of view, I know it's an ultrasound, what model it is, I know what operating system it runs, what serial number it has, any asset information or tags, so custom attributes that I can go and add down the bottom here. So when I have a device, I've obviously discovered the info and I can provide that to Michael for reporting purposes. But what I want to do is I want to look at the risks of that device. So one of the things that is really interesting when Michael was talking about vulnerabilities and CVEs. So this device actually has a CVE, and I'll go through that in a second. But a CVE itself isn't necessarily the issue. And we talked about that in terms of dwell time. So the problem is not the CVE, it's the exploitability of that. So what we care about when we calculate a risk score is we're looking at the likelihood of that device being compromised, how the device is actually connected, and any compensating controls that are in place that can potentially reduce our risk score. So when we look at a CVE, which is down here, As Michael mentioned, there's a CVE, it's got a CVSS risk score. What we can actually see is information from the manufacturer. So in this case, there's actually some compensating controls from GE as to what to do with this device. Now, sometimes a manufacturer will give us additional information. So they might say there's a patch available, or there's a update available, or compensating controls in this case are available. But in some cases, manufacturers have no answer. So there's a vulnerability. They don't have any options around what you can do with the device. So this is a perfect example of whereby cyber and biomedical need to work together. So if I've got 4 options, let's say a patch, an upgrade, compensating controls, or doing something like network enforcement, what's the best option? How does it work? So if, in this example, the compensating controls are not sufficient, we're going to look at doing a network security policy as a way of protecting that vulnerable asset, because I don't have the option to always remove that device or isolate it. So the question becomes, well, how do I do that? Now, having worked in healthcare and in networking and security, I understand how these things work. But for me to build a security policy, in this case for an ultrasound, would be a lot of time and research on my behalf. And then I've got to do that obviously for every make and model that we have. Then the question then becomes, how do I enforce it? And this is a perfect example of where partnerships in cyber really come together. So this is the dive buddies. In this case, it's Medigate and Fortinet. So our job is to provide the security policy for these devices. So when we go and look at, say, a GE imaging device, we can provide the firewall rule sets of all the ports and protocols that this device uses that can be enforced on the FortiGate. Or we could be doing that at a layer 2 point of view if that's the way the enforcement wanted to be done. So the goal for us is to provide the context and to be very clear about what our role is. So our role is not to do enforcement, because there are fantastic tools such as Fortinet out there that will be in your environment that are the logical enforcement point. Our job is to provide that context. So if we come, I guess, full circle, our job is twofold. So one is to identify the assets and be able to provide the information that Michael, for example, could report back into the government, but then also be able to provide the context. If there's a decision made as to there's a vulnerability or an exposure that it provides a risk or something that's misbehaving, how do we go and mitigate it? Well, there's a few options. And again, cyber and biomedical need to be dive buddies and look after each other. Now, Michael's going to actually take back over here, because in this case, I might present him with a set of firewall rules, but maybe there's some things that he can do different. Back to you, Michael.
That's excellent. Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. I think, again, it kind of highlights why collaboration is so important within this space, right? The visibility and the deep insights and the controls that are available, right? We want to respond to incidents in a tactical manner that mitigates downtime. We don't always want to respond with the sledgehammer where we have to shut everything down, right? Because it's simply not an option. I think the other thing that's very important to highlight is Medigate has a very rich level of contextual awareness as to how these assets communicate with one another, right? And we run into a scenario where within the IT realm, we're familiar with IP-based traffic, internet protocol-based traffic, in which is encrypted. It's difficult to intercept, it's difficult to manipulate. Within the OT realm, we're in a different dynamic where there are a plethora of different OT protocols and ways of communicating or communication between these OT assets. And the rich insights that are shared between Medigate and Fortinet allow us to actually integrate and communicate in the same way to say, right, well, we're seeing OT-based traffic that needs to be intercepted or blocked or observed, and we can do that on both solutions. So that's excellent, Steve. We appreciate you going through that. I think, again, what we're kind of focusing on here is looking at that's how we address the core fundamentals, right? Visibility, identification of an incident, and some proactive activities to mitigate potential vectors of compromise or vulnerability. I think one of the things that we also want to look at is, well, what are the ways that we're moving forward in the future to kind of get ahead of some of these challenges? When we look back at what history has taught us, we've observed that sometimes we can't always hide these big critical assets, right? Sometimes it's simply not possible. And as humans, we've adopted ways of ultimately adding some level of deception to the way that we operate. And that's something that we've seen way back since 1918, right? Where the Navy forces began to leverage what's known as dazzle camo. And what that meant was submarines that were attempting to target them found it incredibly difficult because they couldn't judge the course and the speed of that asset. We also saw that within, well, 1934, there was the adoption of kill chains, right? So how can we earn a strong level of rich reconnaissance information about a target so that we can engage in a tactical manner, how we can mitigate our losses when we engage as well. We then saw that there were kind of the development of squads that began to deploy decoys. So looking at, well, how can we really begin to pull threat actors away from our critical assets? How can we observe the ways that they engage? How can we add an extra ingredient to really monitor the activities that the adversaries are adopting to build proactive mechanisms of resilience that cover multiple aspects, whether it's, say, land, air, space, and sea. When we begin to step into the digital realm, that's where we've seen different organizations like Lockheed Martin develop and communicate the cybersecurity kill chain. Again, we've covered the MITRE ATT&CK framework as well. What we're looking at here is how can we adopt deception techniques to lure threat actors away from critical assets and ultimately fingerprint their activities. And one of the proactive activities that we can now perform is taking physical assets, such as a fusion pump. We can digitalize that asset in the digital realm, deploy it throughout the network as a decoy, almost like a digital twin, and again send it dummy telemetry data to fingerprint activities that may be performed by a threat actor. And again, so that we can fingerprint and monitor those activities and proactively respond in a cohesive way from multiple avenues within the business. Now, this is something that's very important to us because, again, we want to ensure that we're not invoking any disruption to critical assets that are within these critical sectors that are specifically supporting human life, right? And I think it's very simple now to actually observe some of the key activities that have taken place, not only nationally, but on a global landscape as well. So between Fortinet and Medigate, we've certainly looked at how do we address the core fundamentals of what's required, whether it's best practice cyber hygiene versus the compliance requirements of the Australian Critical Infrastructure Act that we can assume and make assumptions around expansion. And then what other things can we do above and beyond that to add that further insight and avoid and mitigate operational disruption. So I'm going to hand over to Josh now. Certainly appreciate everyone coming to join and have a preliminary conversation around kind of the solution offering that we do have and the way that we're combating some of these malicious activities. Josh, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much. And Stephen, thank you for that insight into the fact that lifts can be hacked. I'll be taking the stairs at every hospital from now on. And Michael, if you could sort out one of those inflatable tanks for the back of my place, that'd be really handy. So thank you so much for taking the time and listening. We do have a couple of questions we are going to go through. These were sent beforehand, and so one of the ones is around what's Fortinet or either of you thinking when it comes to addressing social engineering risks?
Michael, I think I defer to you for that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we look at the Australian Critical Infrastructure Act, we can begin to discover that there is a tremendous level of attention focused on an all hazards approach, right? So when we're protecting critical services and functions within the healthcare and medical sector, we need to look at all factors of disruption, which may be from a cybersecurity perspective, it might be flooding from a natural hazard or a fire, but also that social engineering aspect to hold people to account. And one of the key things that we're really focusing on is addressing the key way that organizations are being compromised within the medical, but also the OT space. And that's avenues of people obtaining access to assets that they simply should not have access to. That might be an external threat actor, or it might be somebody that's internal. Again, invoking strong ways of verifying identity within a trusted window for changes to be performed is probably the key thing that we're really focusing on, that privileged access management, that secure remote access functionality. That's one of the key ways that we're really identifying who should and who should not be allowed to access an asset. More importantly, who should actually be able to influence some form of change of state as well.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how does the offered system auto-detect or alert device changes new and removed within a number of segregated VLANs?
I'll grab that one. So interesting question. So in healthcare environments, in my experience, we kind of have the full range. So I've got customers that has, for example, 7 completely isolated networks. So whether that's from a healthcare network, a corporate network, an engineering network, etc., to those that are basically fully converged. So the short answer is, as a predominantly passive detection tool, there's 2 components to the Mitigate platform. There's an on-premise component and a cloud component. The on-premise component is basically called a collection server. Its job is to parse traffic and strip out any PHI and PII and send that metadata to our cloud. Those collection servers have multiple interfaces, and because we are passive and receiving traffic, we can actually connect into multiple network segments and basically tap into those without obviously bridging them together. So typically what I've seen is I've had customers actually tap into multiple networks, and those networks, sometimes they're vendor managed as well, so that always makes it even more fun. So I'm happy if anyone wants to reach out and discuss that one further. But yeah, generally that's how we would tap in to multiple networks and to be able to pull the information passively. Oh, sorry, there was a second part, wasn't there, around alerting? So yes, in the platform, I didn't want to go through the whole platform, but there is the concepts of alerting. There's a number of pre-built alerts in the platform, plus custom alerts. So to give you a real world example, I had a customer have a requirement to receive an alert when a new medical device was found in any 3 particular VLANs, or outside of those 3 VLANs, sorry. So in their environment, what they were looking for is alerting around misconfiguration of devices being connected in. So absolutely, we can alert on that. And we can also alert if a device has gone offline. That's an interesting one as well, because in hospitals, devices do get connected and turned off and hidden in cupboards. But yeah, absolutely, we can help with that.
Coming from someone that has decommissioned an old hospital in the past, I can promise you that absolutely does happen. One of the questions from the session today is there any cloud-based risk assessments and compliance verification that looks specifically at privacy acts that we're aware of?
Great question, Michael. That might be more your domain.
Great handball, nice.
Did you like that one? Well, I just did the last one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're conscious that there are many different standards that are certainly front of mind. One of the key activities that Fortinet has performed is worked with independent industry recognized boards to hold us to account as to the core functions and features that we can actually perform. So we can share some context and some collateral around what we can do. Some of it is already built into our platform, and other parts of that are supporting documents that you can leverage and apply to your industry and the context of your environment, because obviously we want to ensure that when you're actually adopting some form of governance or framework or standard, it's not going to break your network or your environment. So we want to apply it in a pragmatic manner. But I'll share some further context and maybe some collateral around that, and we can dig into it a bit deeper.
Great, thank you. And I've just got one more quick one. Can fire be supported by medical devices?
So fire, FHIR. So that is, if we're referring to the same thing, a standards-based or a proposed standard actually for medical device interoperability of sharing of information. So that's an interesting question. So the short answer is medical devices can do. And where it gets interesting is inter-manufacturer cooperation. So that's always the interesting one. A lot of medical providers use proprietary systems. Where I can see that working is actually, if I use Philips as an example, something like using, it's gone out of my head now, the name of it, but basically the head end system would be the tool that talks to other systems. I haven't read that draft legislation in detail. What I am interested with, and this is something Michael and I discuss regularly, is when these are put in place, whether security controls are thought about at the time with the way that the draft is being put in place, rather than it being done retrospectively. So the short answer is I can see some manufacturers already looking at it. How that works between manufacturers is an interesting one.
Excellent. So how I did that? Balance the questions between the two.
Surely got one really hard one for Michael to end, surely.
Purely by accident. We've actually run out of time for the questions at this stage. But look, if we didn't get to your question today, we will be answering over the next the coming week. And I just want to call out again, we do have those 3 handouts that are available in the control panel, so please do check them out. There's going to be a recording of today's webinar made available to all attendees, and we really do encourage that you share those. If you've got any questions that you wanted to, you can, all our contact details are there. I just want to thank Michael and Stephen. Thanks so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for those that attended. And keep an eye out for the next one of the Connected Health webinars. Thank you so much, and we'll leave the session open for a few more minutes if there's anything that comes up. Thanks all.